Remembering it always the hard bit. Yeah, I like the banners. That's it. Say no. Believe in Britain. Do you believe in Britain? I couldn't hear you. Do you believe in Britain? Thank you.
Oh, yes. There'll be more. Thank you, Nigel, for that absolutely fantastic, inspiring address. I think none of us are in any doubt, if any of us were, of just what an historic few weeks we have and what an opportunity we have. It's been so long coming, so let's all of us make it happen. Well, we've got time for some questions, probably not most of them because we've had dozens and dozens and dozens of questions sent, but I will try and get through as many as I possibly can in the time we have available. So the first question in the pile is from Sarah Walker-Smith. Now, Sarah says, getting our sovereignty, democracy and freedom back is very appealing, but will the career politicians in London do any better for the British people? You cynic, Sarah. Nigel, do you want to have a go at that one first?
She's more cynical than me, isn't she, Sarah? Look, Sarah, let me repeat let me just say one thing. I was going to say, if we vote to leave, but I'm going to correct that. When we vote to leave, what we must make sure is that the British government don't do to us what the Danish government did when they voted no to Maastricht, and what the Irish government have done twice when they voted no to treaties, and they've made them vote again, haven't they? And overturned the result. We must make sure that no means no. We must make sure that a vote to leave means it actually is carried out. Thereafter, Sarah, I think in a way, I answered your question. You know, we could vote, as a self-governing independent nation, we could vote for a rotten government who made an absolute horlicks of everything. But we could, at the next election, get rid of them and replace them with a new government who get rid of all the useless legislation and put their own in place. It's called parliamentary democracy. It's why Churchill said it may be inefficient, but it's a damn sight better than being governed by the European Commission and not being able to change a single piece of law.
And Simon, would you like to add your perspective to that?
Well, surprisingly, I agree with Nigel. But, do you know, I think there's a lot of people out there who would be brilliant politicians and who see the emasculation of our parliament at the moment, where, as Nigel said, 75% of laws are passed in Europe. These people have no real power. And the ratchet is going to keep going. You know, if we do vote to stay in, fewer and fewer of our laws will be made here and more will be made abroad. When, and I hope it is when, we vote to come out, it's a real encouragement to brilliant young people to go into Parliament and really to change things. And I'm an optimist. I think we will end up with a better class of politician because they'll have more responsibility and it will become a seriously proper job again and not just a job for superannuated research assistants, which it is at the moment.
So there you go, Sarah, that's your answer. Nobody's saying that it will be utopia from the day after we leave the EU, and it's true, our own politicians are more than capable of making their own mistakes, but they will be accountable to us and we will have control of our destiny again. The second question from Erica Jones, who asks, will the Working Time Directive, paternity and maternity rights and equal rights clauses be rescinded if we leave the EU?
Erica, we will be a self-governing independent nation, free and able to do whatever we choose. And none of us on the Brexit side are arguing that, as Patrick says, immediately after we leave, that we're going to scrap everything and start again. What we need to do is firstly stop the flow of new European laws showering down upon us, and secondly, through time and consideration, we can go through the about 160,000 pages now of close-type legislation that's been given to us from Brussels. We can look at what bits of it are sensible and give people fair and reasonable rights, and which bits of it are burdening our businesses, stopping our 5 million men and women entrepreneurs from getting on, making money, employing people and paying taxes. We can scrap whatever we like, we can put in place whatever we like, but as far as basic, decent rights for workers are concerned, they'll be as safe with the British Parliament as they would be with any other government in the Western world.
Simon?
Won't it be a wonderful moment when we can have a proper debate in Parliament again about these things, rather than the sham debates that go on at the moment, because really we can only tinker at the margins. And if the British public decide they want a working time directive, let Westminster issue it. If the British people decide they want paternity rights, let the British Parliament do that for them. But won't it be brilliant when we live in a country again where what happens in Parliament actually matters, where they're not looking in their wing mirrors to see whether Big Daddy in Brussels actually approves of this, but they can do things that they want, or rather they can do things that the British public at an election have asked them to do. And that is what sovereignty means, and that's why it's such a wonderful thing to have it, and again why we need to vote to come out of this.
I'm old enough, Simon, to remember when general elections were fought on employment legislation, on trade union rights. You know, these are the things that really fired the country up in the 70s and the 80s and decided our vote. Do you know why we don't discuss those things in general elections anymore? Because the British Parliament has no power over them. So we fight elections basically on schools and hospitals. Through the 90s and up until the last year's, what I'd call the SNP election, and fear of that woman north of the border, but basically, well, it's true, basically all the previous 4 or 5 elections, we debated who'd be best to run schools and hospitals, because it's frankly all the British government has actually got left.
And what's even worse, of course, any attempt to discuss immigration policy at a general election, our political rulers just shrug their shoulders and say, well, if it's about people coming in from Europe, nothing we can do. And that also exemplifies the problem. It must be 40 years since we had a proper debate on immigration policy at a general election, probably in 1970, actually. We haven't done so since then because there isn't any point.
So there you go, Erica. It's about trusting. It's about trusting the British people and British democracy. And I have to say, if by the next election we've reached that happy day, we're out of the EU, and one of the major parties pops up and as part of their manifesto says they plan to scrap every employment right and all maternity and maternity leave, I don't think they'd get very many votes, and they think they know about that. So I think trust the good sense of the British people and respect their democratic verdict, and we won't go far wrong.
I agree with that totally.
Now, there's a question from A.D. Guttridge, who asks, what will happen to EU nationals that are working full-time in Britain when we leave the EU? My wife is Polish, has lived here for 6 years and works full-time.
Look, you know, I'd be the first person to say we have let too many people in. It's been out of control. But, Mr. Guttridge, the key point is this, that everybody that's come since 2004 has come legally, all right? They've come legally because that is what the law has allowed them to do. And we would not, as a party that believes in democracy, liberty and the rule of law, we and the rest of the Brexiteers would not suggest for one moment that retrospectively any of that would be changed. But what we would say, Mr. Guttridge, is hereafter what we want to do is to sort out a work permit scheme and an immigration policy based on the Australian-style point system, so that we can choose who comes to Britain, we can make sure they haven't got criminal records, we can make sure they're prepared to pay their own health insurance for the first few years, and in doing that, we can drastically reduce the numbers that are coming, we can increase the average quality of who's coming, and we will stop discriminating against people from India. You know, the Indian engineer or the New Zealand doctor now finds it very tough to get to Britain because we have an open door to unskilled labour from southern and eastern Europe. Wouldn't that be a better, fairer, more equitable way of running an immigration policy?
This is precisely the sort of scare story that I know at some stage in the next 3 months the government is going to put out. There'll be entirely honest, legal, decent people here, such as Mrs. Guttridge, that they will say will be frog-marched to Dover and put on a boat. That is absolute tripe. It's not going to happen. Theresa May, a few weeks ago, was flirting with the idea of taking the passports away of people who were suspected or convicted of terrorist crimes, and that couldn't happen. If we can't take a passport away from a terrorist, we're not going to take it away from a hard-working Polish person who happens to be legally in this country. It's madness.
And I have to say, AD, I haven't heard of a single senior respected voice on the Leave side of the campaign, or even, I should say, a disrespected one, suggest retrospective removals to people who came here quite legally. It's simply not on the agenda. Right, the next question is from Karen Allen, who asks, why isn't TTIP being loudly broadcast to the British general public as a good reason to vote out?
Well, Karen, it is amongst the trade union movement, and it's being talked about very, very much. But the problem is, Karen, and here's the problem. Here is the problem with that question and with answering it. How many people in this room have heard of TTIP? Hands up. How many have not heard of TTIP? And that's the problem. And that's the problem. The problem is very few people know about it. Okay, really quickly, TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership deal, is a proposed deal that will take place between the European Union and the United States of America. If it was just a deal that removed tariffs and barriers to trade, nobody would have a problem. But it's a deal that opens up the possibility, and there's legal opinion on this, of the National Health Service being open, chunks of it, to being bought up by large American corporate companies. And it also has a disputes mechanism that goes above the British Parliament and the British Court. So, Karen, in essence, that is the problem with it. And there are many in the trade unions and on the left who are deeply concerned about this and who will vote for us to leave the EU, such is their fear of the National Health Service falling into the hands, as they see it, of foreign profiteers. But it is a technical issue, and if I spend my time, Karen, on platforms like this and on television and radio talking about issues that very few people understand, I'll fail to get out the bigger message, all right? And the bigger messages I've tried to put across to you tonight. But one last thing, if I can. I'm getting a bit cheesed off with this referendum being portrayed in some of our daily newspapers as being a blue-on-blue civil war. That it's all about the Tory party being split, it's all about whether Dave can survive, or Boy George can survive, and is Boris going to take over, or Michael Gove going to take over, and it's a sort of internal debate in the Conservative Party. Even though the Tories have a majority, 2/3 of voters in Britain did not vote Conservative, and they're going to get very bored by this blue-on-blue debate. We must not allow the media or anybody else to portray Euroscepticism as being a phenomenon on the right of British politics. Indeed, those of you that can remember the referendum 40 years ago will remember some of the most powerful exponents of Britain being a patriotic, democratic, self-governing nation were Michael Foot and Peter Shaw and Tony Benn and many millions of Labour voters. And today out there are millions of Labour voters, there are millions of trade unionists, and people even to the left of that who would agree with so much of what has been said by the three of us on this platform tonight. This referendum, folks, is not about left and right, it's about right and wrong. And I believe right is to govern our own country.
I must say I'm greatly looking forward to the moment in the campaign, I don't know when it will come, when Jeremy Corbyn finally gets up one morning and says, I can't lie about this any longer. There's a man who, as long as I've known him in politics, I don't know him as a person, but I've followed him in politics since the early 1980s, has been one of the most vigorous anti-Europeans I think I've ever met in politics, and has called again and again for the referendum that we are now having. And what a surprise, we're having a referendum and he's not saying anything about it, because his party don't want to come out, or some of his parliamentary party don't, but tens of thousands of people who follow him, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who follow him, and who like his style of politics, do want to come out, and he's with them, and he dare not say so. I suspect that he'll have a Martin Luther moment. He will get up one morning and say, I can do no other, I've got to say, we have to come out. And at that moment, what Nigel has just said will become absolutely apparent to the entire country, that there is a massive proportion of natural Labour voters who care as much about our democracy as anyone on the so-called right of politics, and they will fight for it.
Well, there you go, Karen. What a great question. And one of the things I'll take away from tonight that I must say I was surprised of was the show of hands that probably 2/3 of you in the audience hadn't been engaged by this issue of TTIP. And that tells me that there's a lot more we can do to get the message out there, because one thing I know about the British people, right and left, is overwhelmingly they support their NHS. They've paid into it all their lives. They expect it to be there for them in their hour of need. And perhaps the one thing they really prioritise is that every other political force in the country maybe has forgotten what the N stands for of NHS. It's the National Health Service, not the International Health Service.
Quite right, quite right.
And of course, once we're outside the EU, we can make that N mean what it says.
Could I just say one other thing on that, if I may, Patrick? Won't it be brilliant on the 27th of June, the day after the count, that we can actually sit down and negotiate our own trade arrangements with the United States of America? That it won't matter what Barack Obama thinks about Europe. We're told he's going to try and scare us or do his bit to scare us into staying. That's irrelevant. But the day after we have voted to come out, we can make our own arrangements with America. You may not know this, we are the biggest single overseas investor in America. They need us so desperately. Large chunks of their industry would simply cease to function if we took our money away. They need us so badly, they will do a very good trade deal with us, and it will be a fine example to the rest of the world of what we can do when we can stand on our own 2 feet. And I'm sure in any trade deal this country does unilaterally with America, selling the National Health Service will not be part of it.
Yeah. Well, we now have what I think I can describe as a non-political question, but one that I've ruled very much in order. And it's from Carla Powell and Paul Nielsen, directed to Nigel specifically. And it says as follows: Nigel Farage, will you come to our wedding? There's more. It says, me and my fiancé met because of you.
No!
Yeah. Because of you and your passion for our great country. Free bar, especially for you.
When's the wedding?
Hopefully next year in Wales.
Hopefully next year in Wales, by which time we'll be a free, independent country. And if I can come, I'd love to. And the very best luck and wishes to both of you from all of us here this evening. Isn't that lovely? Isn't that great?
And can I ask you then, Carla and Paul, if you seek out one of our staff at the back, maybe Lisa Duffy, and give your details, and we'll keep tabs on you and when you set the date, and let Nigel know and give him as much notice as we can.
Thank you.
There's a free bar.
Right, this is a question rather more prosaic and to the point from Ashley Banks. How are farmers going to be fixed when we leave the EU?
Ashley Banks, where are you? There we are, nice to see you again. Ashley's question is a very important question because one of the scare stories that's been put out, and I've seen it not just in England but in Wales as well, I did a debate against Carwyn Jones, the First Minister of Wales. He challenged me to a head-to-head debate. Quite why these guys do it, I don't really know. It's a bit like going up to the biggest bloke in the pub and saying, I'll see you outside in 5 minutes. Anyway. But Carwyn Jones said in this debate, actually, he said, without the European Union, all farming would cease in Wales. Now, I did say to him that Welshmen, and I said it carefully, I said Welshmen had been tending sheep on the hills of Wales. I was very careful. And the answer to your question, but it's an important question, because Cameron was in Kent the other day saying, well, Nigel Farage couldn't give a damn about Britain's farmers. They would face massive tariffs and be unable to sell their products into the European marketplace. And the answer is very simple. It is that before we joined the common market, we had a scheme in place that looked after British farmers. We had it from 1947 to 73. It was called the Deficiency Payments System. And at the moment, we spend £6 billion a year on agricultural support. The problem is, 3 billion of it is supporting French farmers and farmers across the rest of Europe. And I propose we stop helping farmers in France and across the rest of Europe, and we'll have plenty of money to continue supporting British farmers, and that's exactly what we will do. But can I just say that a subset of the common agricultural policy is something called the common fisheries policy. And if there was one industry we could hold up and say to the British public how much better off we'd be outside the European Union, it is our fishing industry. And you go to the east coast of this country and you look across, well, you can't see, but if you looked a long way across, there's a country called Norway. And I'm getting a bit cheesed off with Dave telling me how ghastly everything in Norway is. And I think to myself, wouldn't it be dreadful for us to be like Norway? Can you imagine it? Rich, happy, and with a 200-mile exclusive economic zone, which are their territorial waters, and what our political class have done to the British fishing industry is nothing short of a total betrayal, and we will take back our territorial waters.
I've lived in the countryside all my life, and I've grown up with agriculture going on around me, even in the days before 1973, when heaven knows how it existed because the European Union wasn't there to help it. What Nigel says is absolutely right. We make a huge net contribution to Europe every year, and I know that our farmers, for strategic reasons, do in some cases need help. The government will have far more money to help them afterwards. But our farmers have shown through terrible crises such as the foot and mouth crisis of 2001 that whatever bounces are bowled to them, they can come back. Our farmers have generations of expertise. In this part of the world, we have the most brilliant arable farming, probably in Europe. They can survive. They can more than survive. They can flourish. They don't need to be spoon-fed by daddy in Brussels. Our farmers, using their expertise in collaboration with our government, can make a massive success of what they do. And it's taken maybe 43 years to make some farmers believe they can't survive outside Europe. I hope after the 23rd of June, they will be delightfully proved wrong.
Right, we now have a question from Henry Collins, which I'm actually going to ask Simon to answer first, given his background as a historian and biographer and author. And it concerns a guy who's regarded as the godfather of Eurofederalism, a Frenchman called Jean Monnet, who was most active in the middle of the 20th century. And the question from Henry is, does Jean Monnet's quote, about how Europe should be guided towards a superstate without the people knowing what is happening, confirm that unless we grasp this opportunity to withdraw from the EU, we are condemning ourselves to becoming part of a United States of Europe?
Patrick is right to say that Jean Monnet was a godfather of the European Union. Mind you, I've always thought the main godfather of the European Union, the man who gave everyone in that generation the idea of unifying Europe, was somebody called Adolf Hitler. But that's a very unpopular thing to say, particularly in Brussels. And I'm not being entirely frivolous, because so many of those Europeans, particularly in France, which had in 1950 been invaded 3 times in the previous 80 years by the Germans, and had seen German ideas on European Union, which were even less democratic, if that's possible, than the present set of ideas about European Union. They wanted to stop it happening again. But if you look at European history since 1950 or so, from the era of Jean Monnet, they're always saying, we need to keep this quiet, we don't need to tell the people. And we were sucked into this the minute we got into negotiations in the early 1970s. There's a famous moment in British political history when Ted Heath comes back from having signed the Treaty of Brussels in 1972, and he shows the small print of the treaty to Alec Douglas Hume, who was his foreign secretary. I knew Alec Hume, I knew Ted Heath actually, I don't usually admit to that in public, but I knew Alec Hume, and he was one of the most decent men ever put on this planet. And Alec Hume looked at the small print and he said, Ted, I've noticed that you have committed us to go into a monetary union by 1980. And Ted said, yes. And Alec Hume said, well, you didn't ask us being the cabinet. And Ted said, well, of course I didn't, because you wouldn't have agreed. And for the same reason he didn't ask the British people, because we wouldn't have agreed either. Happily, the project of having a common European currency by 1980 didn't happen. And even more happily, when it did happen in 1999, we stayed out of it. But Europe has only ever developed by having such complicated treaties that you have to be a university professor in order to grasp the small print, and even many of them can't do it. And this is what we have to expect if we stay in. There will be in Brussels now a huge agenda covering everything from workers' rights to immigration to the bend on a banana, that they are waiting to impose upon us. They don't talk about it now because they know that they will ensure that we vote to come out, but those things will be imposed on us the minute we come out, because this is all part of the tradition of secrecy and dishonesty that has characterized our membership of the European Union and indeed the European Union's history since the early 1950s. Don't forget, in 1970, in the Conservative manifesto of that year, on which Heath was returned, he said, we will only go into Europe with the, and he used this exact phrase, the full-hearted consent of the British Parliament and people. The British Parliament gave a second reading by 8 votes to the European Communities Bill in 1972, and the British public were never consulted before we went in. So that's the sort of history of dishonesty, and this thing, which for us began with a lie and a deceit, now needs to end by people like us telling the truth as it is, and telling our fellow countrymen what they can expect if they stay in, because it will be generations more of this. We're not like that as a people. We're a straightforward, honest, decent bunch of people in this country. We're fed up with being lied to, but that's all we have to look forward to if we stay in.
Right, we've got time for just one more question, and it's from Bob Burbeck, and it's as follows. How will the European army work? Where will the money come from? And who will be in charge?
Well, it's very interesting, isn't it? Again, I'm going to talk about Nick Clegg again, because I like talking about Nick Clegg. So in that debate in 2014, Nick Ferrari was invigilating, and I said, if we continue to be part of this union, we would find ourselves ever more closely wrapped up into a European army. And Clegg said, it's getting back to your point, Simon, about how dishonest they've been right from the start. I'm going to go further than dishonest. Clegg was an outright blooming liar, because he said that night that Mr Farage is trying to scare the public about there becoming a European army, which is no more than a dangerous fantasy. That's what Clegg said, and now Mr Juncker, the Commission President, says we must have a European army as quickly as possible. When you ask how is it going to work, well, it already has established its own command structure in Brussels. Who is going to pay for it? Well, if we stay members of the European Union, we will continue to pay for it. And who is going to run it? I think Mrs. Merkel has worked that one out.
Many of you will know that we won the Battle of Waterloo with some help from the Prussians. And large contingents of the Prussian army were stationed in this part of the world. There was a big Prussian garrison in Ely. And William Cobbett wrote about this in Rural Rides, that the British soldiers and indeed British officers deeply resented being put under the command of these people because they came from a separate military tradition. They didn't do things in the way that we did, and they were quite horrible to our soldiers in the way that they were horrible to their own soldiers, but our soldiers weren't quite used to that. Nothing's changed in 200 years. Can you imagine our brilliantly trained, brave, selfless, highly professional army having to take orders routinely from, I don't know, Romanian generals, Lithuanian colonels? You tell me. Of course not. If we stay in, a European army will not function because our army, however professional it is, will simply not be able to cope with the relative lack of professionalism of so many other European armies. Don't take my word for it, ask any defence expert. There are, of course, good European armies, there are individual national armies, there are also many very second-rate ones. This is, to use Nick Clegg's phrase, a dangerous fantasy. The trouble is, it's not Nigel's fantasy, it's now the fantasy of the people in Brussels. We will pay for it. We can't really properly defend ourselves. We've had a Prime Minister who I think has been absolutely derelict in looking after the army and has particularly betrayed our servicemen and women. And has shown a callous disregard for the sacrifices of many of our wounded veterans and the families, the bereaved families of many brave men and women who've given their lives for our country in the last 10 or 15 years. And those are the people who deserve our defence spending, and those are the people who deserve our attention and our money and our care and our concern. We must not get involved in a project such as this, but it seems, again, that the only way to stop it is by voting to come out of this mess on the 23rd of June.
And Bob, I just must say that the last of your questions, who will be in charge, is particularly pertinent because every forces veteran and indeed serving person that I've ever spoken to, they're offering, aren't they? They're offering to risk laying down their lives in the national interest, and it really means something to them that their oath of allegiance is to the monarch, to Her Majesty the Queen. And if you ask people to give that supreme sacrifice, they have to believe in the allegiance you ask them to hold. So a European army cannot possibly work, cannot possibly hold that level of allegiance, which is the least those people deserve, who are the best young people we have from all backgrounds and are prepared to stand up and, if necessary, risk and give their lives. So who will be in charge of our armed forces? Her Majesty the Queen, for as long as any of us have breath. Now, what a fantastic meeting we've had. Can I first of all ask you to give a warm and generous round of applause to a giant of the Eurosceptic movement who has written in columns, arguments, books, essays, magazines, newspapers down the years in favour of Britain being a self-governing, independent, sovereign nation once again, who's never given up, you know, and probably almost to the same level as us in UKIP has taken abuse and brickbats from the politically correct metropolitan classes over the years. He hasn't failed us yet, and quite clearly he's in great fighting form, and he's not going to fail us on any day between now and June the 23rd. So a big hand for Simon Heffer. Thank you. And of course, too, to a man who probably 20 years ago was fighting a very lonely battle, perhaps standing on a railway station with a mobile phone more like the size of a brick, waiting for a regional reporter to come along and give him some airtime to spread the message, a very unpopular message at that time, about the need for Britain to get its sovereignty and independence back, and who stuck with it, and through sheer dynamism, communication ability, force of personality, occasionally a little bit of bloody mindedness, one would say, to drive this issue on till we are at this incredibly exciting stage 20 years later of having forced the political class to give us this choice, and now to be almost within sniffing distance, within tasting distance of bringing home our democracy. I ask you to give a huge ovation to Nigel Farage.
At that juncture, we'll stroll off, shall we?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah. There we are. There we are. There we are. There we are. Take them home with you. Use them in the campaign. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Thanks very much. Hello. All right.